Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second panel of today on colonial legacies. It's a privilege to chair this. I'm Michael Robinson. We're going to start with a talk by Anotida Chikumbu on the forgotten men, African and coloured veterans of World War II and the decolonisation of Zimbabwe circa 1945 to 1980. And Anotida Chikumbu is a Zimbabwean historian and journalist. He's currently a PhD candidate and teaching associate in the Department of History at the University of Massachusetts. So whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of the session, Dr. Mike. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul, for organizing this. Thank you very much to all the members of the Military Welfare East Network for doing the work that has gotten us together to this stage. I also want to thank the first speakers, including the keynote address by Dr. Matthew and all those professors that just gave their talks right before me. I'm going to just briefly talk about the research that I've been doing. This is part of my doctoral thesis. It's a thesis that has got several chapters, about 6 of them. But today I'm just going to particularly talk about chapter 2, which I have also submitted for publication to a special issue of genealogy. So I would very much welcome some feedback so that I can be doing some editing and putting in more contributions to the research. I am just going to divide my talk into 4. I'm just going to tell you briefly what this research is all about overall, like the entire thesis, and then I'm just going to particularly focus on the second chapter, that is the chapter on mobilization and recruitment. So the topic that you see right there that says the forgotten men, African and colored veterans of the Second World War and the decolonization of Zimbabwe is just a simple story that talks about the recruitment of African and colored men, their recruitment, their wartime experiences, their demobilization and reintegration experiences into civilian life right immediately after the war ended. The argument that I advance is that these experiences did frustrate these African and colored soldiers to the extent that when the war ended, although that frustration consequently pitchforked them into political activity that initially manifested in the form of politically oriented civil disobedience and then later on anti-colonial nationalist political activities. So that is all about the research that I do, and that is particularly the PhD thesis. So now for this talk, I'm just going to particularly focus on the second chapter. But before I talk about mobilization and recruitment, I'm just going to put a few things into context so that you understand the kind of history behind it, the context behind it, so that we all understand. I'm not going to assume that you have prior knowledge of this particular topic. So first and foremost, I'm sure I've clarified this before, but I'll do it again. If you can all see from the PowerPoint. Southern Rhodesia, I'm going to be changing. At some point you hear me say Southern Rhodesia. At some point you hear me say Rhodesia. At some point you hear me say Zimbabwe. But Southern Rhodesia was the name given to colonial Zimbabwe. Rhodesia was also the name given to colonial Zimbabwe without that first name that you see there that says Southern. It's called Southern because there was Northern and Southern Rhodesia. So Zimbabwe is now the name that is given to the country today as we speak, and that is where I happen to come from. So now, as I put things into context, I'm going to talk initially about the outbreak of the war and how Southern Rhodesia, that is colonial Zimbabwe, got to be involved in this war. Because I know many of you might be asking the question that how can Zimbabwe, because this was a predominantly European war, and from the readings that we have all been exposed to up to this day, the Second World War is usually presented as a predominantly European war, fought in Europe and fought between European powers. But now what happened was that when the Second World War began on 1 September 1939, about 75% of African countries were under British and French colonial administration. and that had consequences, particularly for a colony like Southern Rhodesia, which was under British rule. It was then a self-governing colony, but the political arrangement was that it didn't have what we call diplomatic powers over foreign affairs. So what it means is that it did not have power to declare war or to declare peace. So it was automatically included in a British declaration of war against Germany and against the Axis powers. So that is how Southern Rhodesia joined the war, to contribute to the imperial war effort. And it made very important contributions to this war, which I'm going to talk about. And it was quite unique as a colony, because it is one of the only colonies, it's just Southern Rhodesia and South Africa that we know as South Africa today, where the British set up what was called an Empire A training scheme. So all these fighter pilots, all these bomb aimers that participated in the Second World War in the battles in Europe, they were trained in Southern Rhodesia and trained in South Africa, because it was a bit of a distance from the war zone. So they could mobilize thousands and thousands of people to go and train. They are sent to Southern Rhodesia, they are sent to South Africa. So that was a very important contribution. That's number one. Number two, most of the internment camps, prisoners of war, Polish refugees, German refugees, were kept inside Southern Rhodesia and also South Africa. So those are the two important factors that make it unique as a colony in its contribution to the war effort. And now, as we look at it, we're going to realize that there were two groups of soldiers, or there were two groups of veterans. There were two groups of servicemen. We have those that are serving at the home front, and we have those that are serving abroad. Those who are serving abroad are those that are actually involved in war front combat, fighting in Burma, fighting in Western Europe, or those European theaters of war. But we also have those that are right at the home front. That is, those that are recruited to what? To work at the flying schools that were set up by the British, and those that are recruited to work as prison guards or perform garrison duties at these internment camps that have been set up by the British. So we have two groups of people. But now, with this context, what I particularly focus on with my chapter is how these Africans and coloreds who served in these different contexts that I've been describing to you were mobilized and recruited for the war. So I'm going to just initially talk about what the scholars who have written this before me talk about, and how I'm contributing to that conventional discourse that already exists. So there are basically three arguments that are advanced by scholars that have written before me. From the 1950s up until today, there are basically three things that they talk about. They argue that Africans and coloreds joined the colonial army as policemen and as soldiers, number one, for economic considerations. Number two, for patriotic considerations. And number three, because the colonial army or the military was a prestigious institution. So Africans wanted to be associated with this institution. So these are the three main arguments that come out. But when I studied closely these arguments, looking at the sources that they consulted, most of them consulted the Colonial Archive, which, if you look at it, at that time, when the war began, European newscasts of the time presented Africans as volunteers. They would say Africans are volunteering to join a colonial army because they are patriotic, because they are joining it for economic considerations, and because they think that the colonial army is a prestigious institution. But this is very problematic, because if you go into oral histories, which I do a lot, and you look into what I've looked into that I call wartime ephemera, that is the letters that they sent to their families, that is the kind of memos that they kept for themselves, which they could not give to the colonial authorities because they would be subjected to censorship. You will actually see that there was a significant degree of force and hoodwinking that was used to recruit these Africans into fighting in a colonial army. Because this is the question that worried me so much. I was born exactly 50 years after this war ended. But up to this stage, I've always been asking myself the question that, how could Africans who are under colonial rule join a colonial army to go and fight for an imperial or a colonial cause. So now, when you study closely how Africans were recruited, because that is the question that most of you are asking now, how were these Africans recruited and what was the consequence? So when the war began, Africans were not willing to enlist into the colonial army because they knew very little about the war. So they were not interested at all to join. But the British had 3 key tactics that they used to lure these Africans into joining the colonial forces. Number 1, they presented army life as a source of economic prosperity and economic advancement. So recruitment officers would walk around African villages telling people that if you join the colonial forces, we're going to give you benefits, we're going to give you money, we're going to give you pensions, we're going to give you loans to start businesses. They promised everything and anything, to the extent that they would even say, if you come back from the war, we're going to give you a gold claim, we're going to give you land to mine, we're going to even give you prime freehold farmland to farm, and then your life would be very good. So they deliberately enlarged and over-exaggerated army life so that they present a picture that an army recruit would be well fed, would be well catered for, so that these Africans can join. But why is this problematic? It's problematic because when we go back to the word volunteered, remember, is the key word. So if someone is joining for economic considerations, we must be able to also look into the welfare of Africans at that particular time. So this is what I initially challenged. And my argument is that Africans did not volunteer, but Africans did not have the luxury of choice. They were very desperate. So they're just going to sell in their labor. They're just going to give in once a war begins. And how is this so? I'll just give you a brief history of Southern Rhodesia for the 9 years before the war began. So in 1930, the colonial government passed what was called a Land Apportionment Act, which divided land into European and African areas. The Africans were given land that was inhabitable, where there was low rainfall, rocky soils, and it was very hard to live a life there. And because most Africans depend on agriculture for subsistence farming and all that, they were trapped in a cycle of poverty. To the extent, but 9 years after that law was passed, many of them were in dramatically poor conditions, such that if a colonial officer comes and says, join the army, we are going to give you money, every African was ready, more than ready, to join the colonial forces. So against those circumstances, they're joining not because they are very enthusiastic about the military, but they are in dramatically poor conditions and they have to take care of their families. Remember as well that there was the Great Depression, which also affected the economy during that time. So this is the kind of economy that Africans are enlisting into the forces. So they are not necessarily volunteering because they are patriotic or that because of other reasons, but they are in dramatically poor conditions. Number 2, the second tactic that was used by the British to recruit Africans was propaganda and information manipulation. Lying. What did they lie about? 3 important things. I'll start with the first one. The first lie that they did was that they peddled the propaganda that Hitler is going to come to Africa, is going to come to Southern Rhodesia, is going to take away your land, is going to rape your women, is going to enslave your kids. And so because Africans who were very scared of that propaganda, they began to join. Some of them did actually join because they were lured by that propaganda. But some who questioned this argument asked that, but Hitler is not so different from the British that are actually colonizing us today. Our land was already taken by the British. Our women are being raped by the British. Our kids are being enslaved by the British. So what difference would it make if Hitler is going to come and do the same? So they did not join. So because they did not join because they feel that it's a propaganda, it's information manipulation. So something else had to be done to recruit Africans. Another form of propaganda that they used is the one of just approaching young boys and telling them that and it's a sexist propaganda, by the way, of just approaching young boys and telling them that if you don't join the army, you are a woman. but some of them did not heed to the propaganda because they felt that there were other better reasons that can be provided. So that did not work. So some of them ended up manipulating the contents of the Atlantic Charter. So you know the agreement that was made between President Franklin Roosevelt and President Churchill on the agreement that there should be self-determination to Africans, and promised them that if you join the colonial army, we're going to give you equality with Europeans once the war ends. So that is why some Africans did volunteer to join, because they felt that our aspirations for self-determination is going to be addressed by this war, so I can join. But all this propaganda did not raise the total number of people that were required by the British colonial authorities. So in the end, they had to apply force. And how was force applied? It was applied through chiefs, because the British practiced what we call indirect colonial administration, where they appointed chiefs to meet a labor quotas, where they just say raise the total number of men and list them in the forces. And that is how Africans got to be recruited by force. So lastly, what was the consequence of all this? The consequence was that the British raised men that gave their labor begrudgingly and unwillingly. And the consequence was that they were frustrated at the very point of recruitment to such an extent that they began to exhibit what I like to call politically oriented resistance behaviors during the war. So most of the experiences that I then talk about in the rest of the articles are the ways and means in which these Africans began to show their resistance against colonial oppression, their resistance against the recruitment and mobilization practices. In the interest of time, I would stop here, and then we can extend the discussion during the question and answer session. Thank you so much. Chairperson.